Welcome, welcome. And as always, we will start with our blessing, acknowledging that we are trying to do something to fulfill the divine will. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Give me a moment and I will do the screen share. And we are in Parshat Mishpatim, the Parsha that consists of many laws, mainly of a civil and criminal nature, and the Talmud and the Midrashim, the halachic Midrashim, have a lot to say about each one of these little pieces. Yesterday, we looked at the lex talionis and how the rabbis are able to derive several different categories of damages if someone injures someone else. And it's really very interesting. And if you didn't have a chance to look at yesterday's lesson, I hope you'll check it out. So we're moving on now. Still in a case of personal injury, but a specific case of this personal injury. V'chi yakeh ish et ein avdo, and if a man strikes the eye of his slave, or et ein amato, or the eye of his maidservant, v'shichata, and he destroys it. In other words, essentially, he blinds this person by striking them in the eye. Lechovshi yishalchenu, he must set him free. Going on. Tachat eino, to in the place of his eye. In other words, for the price of his eye. That is, his eye is enough for him to be freed for having done that. I'm just having a very quick thought of slavery, the stories one hears of slavery in the South of the United States, and how many freed slaves there might have been in that particular case. So again, yeah.
But if someone's been blinded and you set them free,
Yes.
how do they survive?
That is actually a question that the Torah is simply not dealing with here. It's a very good question. It's a legitimate question, and it's one that needs to be addressed. It's just not within the realm of what's going on here in terms of the legal ramifications, which is what we're talking about here in the terms of how legality and, and other things sort of, and I would say maybe social consciousness operates.
But what it isn't monetary compensation one of the things that
I'm
comes
so
up?
glad you raised that. I'm so glad you raised that, because that's what we're going to deal with right now. Rashi's going to jump into that particular issue, and you'll see here. So I'm going to let Rashi speak. Et ein avdo, the eye of his slave. Knaani, a Canaanite slave. This is a category of slavery, meaning a non-Jewish, a non-Israelite slave. Again, please understand, we are talking in major chapter headings, and of course, God is in the details, and it really just draws you into further investigation. And of course, your question, Judith, is exactly the kind of thing that, is a reason why we seek to understand further. At any rate, we're not talking about any slaves. And he's going to say, aval, however, one moment to get there, of Ivri, right, an Hebrew slave, Eino Yotze B'Shein V'ayin. He is not set free. He does not literally go out through a tooth or an eye. Kamosha Amarnu Etzel Lo Tetze Ketzei Ta'avadim. As was mentioned back in Exodus chapter 21:7, it's the same chapter, but it's back on verse 7, where it says, she shall not go out like the slaves go out. And what you need to understand is that if his slave happens to be a Hebrew slave, he does not go free, but he gets financial compensation. So in the case of a Hebrew slave, they are in fact compensated for the loss of his eye under the various ways in which compensation is calculated. But in the case of a Canaanite slave, he is no longer a slave. Now, there's going to be, if we are blessed and are able to then take a look at the Torah Tamima, the Torah Tamima is going to go into, I think, a whole bunch of other kinds of considerations. One thing I will tell you is that if it was a male Canaanite slave, the Canaanite slave was supposed to be circumcised. And if in fact the male Canaanite slave was circumcised, that meant that he was on his way to becoming a Hebrew, because the only other aspect, aside from having to give up any idolatry, would be to immerse himself in a mikveh, to be immersed in a mikveh, in which case he would be fully considered a Jew. So how this actually plays out is interesting. Just know we're looking at one aspect, and the point here, of course, that one might see as progressive is the fact that he is freed, that he is no longer a slave. The issue that you raised, Judith, about how this person is to support themselves, well, that is a good question, as I've mentioned. Possibly he has family, and he can go back to his family. And there may be other sources of support for such a person, aside from possibly issues that involve his owner, etc., etc. But I think one thing we should hold on to very much is to understand how progressive in the time that this is being taught, right? That he actually gains his freedom, and of course that's why I'm thinking of the South, where that we read about how brutally slaves were treated, and certainly weren't given their freedom on account of it. Okay, so tachat eino, in the place, for the sake of his eye. And the Mechilta goes on to say, V'chein, it's not just his eye, even though the Torah is being specific here, and the Torah is also going to talk about his tooth, okay? But at least for now, we're talking about we understand in terms of how we interpret this legally, that this is not only for his eye. V'chein bekaf dalid rashi evarim. In other words, and also if his master destroys any one of his 24 extremities. What are we talking about? Etzbaot hayadayim. So in other words, if in fact his owner beats him in such a way that he loses a finger, right? Or he loses a toe, v'haraglayim, and his legs, ushte oznaim, or one of these are the extremities, right? So 10 and 20, and his two ears, v'hachotem, that is his nose, his nostrils, v'rosh hagviyah, or the head, the tip of his membrum, his penis. Shehu gid ha'ama. He's explaining Rosh Hagviyah is understood as to be the sinew of his membrum. V'lama, so it goes on. Well, that begs a question, right? V'lama ne'emar shin v'ayin. So he actually is anticipating the next sentence, and he says, why does the Torah specify tooth and eye? She'im ne'emar ayin, because if in fact, this is now, you're getting into a little bit of Talmudic logic. This is some of the kind of argumentation that you find in the Talmud, that if it only had said eye, v'lo ne'emar shein, and it had not mentioned tooth, hayiti omer, I might argue, ma ayin shenivra imor. Well, when he came into this world, he had his eye with him, right? He was born with eyes, but of course he wasn't born with his teeth. Af kol shenivra imor. In other words, that this law would only apply to anything with which he was born, anything that was created with him. V'harei shein lo nivra imor. And in fact, he wasn't born with any teeth. The imne marsha. So let's go to the other side of this argument. Suppose it had just mentioned tooth, velo ne'emar ayin, and it didn't mention the eye. Hayiti omer, I might think, afilu shen tinok, that we would even include your milk teeth. That in fact, if this was a young, a very young child or something like that, a situation like that, and this person had knocked out a milk tooth, sheyesh la chilufim, which of course will be replaced by his permanent teeth. We might think the law applies to the milk teeth. It doesn't. L'chach ne'emar ayin. And for that reason, it mentions eye. So it does apply to something like part of his body that wasn't created with him when he was born, but it doesn't, on the other hand, if it's something which will be subsequently replaced, it is not, this law does not apply there. Going on to Kaf Zayin, the Shein Avdo, right? So, or if it is the tooth of his slave, or Shein Amato Yapil, if he knocks out the tooth of his slave, or the tooth of his maidservant, the Chofshi Yishalchenu, he again will send him out free. He will free him, Tachachino, to in the place, in other words, compensating him for his tooth. Onwards. We now get onto the case of the goring ox. In other words, this now gets into what happens if you are the not direct cause of an injury to someone else. So the Torah is going a little bit now, moving in. In the previous situations, we were talking about a case where a person is the direct agent of someone's injury. And here we're talking about if someone's an indirect agent. And if an ox gores, lots and lots of Torah Tamima on this. Et ish, a man, or et isha, or a woman, vamate, that they die. In other words, mortally wounds gores another a person, and to a point where the ox kills them. Sakul yisakel ashor, the ox has to be stoned. In other words, essentially it's killed, and we'll find out why it says stoned. Velo ye'achel, and it shall not be consumed. You're not to eat et besaro, you should not eat the flesh of that ox. Uval hashor aki, and the owner of the ox is clean, literally. So Baki here, clean, in other words, he is paid for this. Now we're gonna make a distinction, and the Torah is gonna move on right on that the assumption isn't that an ox is a goring animal. But if, in fact, we're going to see, and I'm anticipating, and I don't want to anticipate too much because we need to look into this now, that the person is aware that the ox is a dangerous animal. But here, the person wasn't aware of it, and nevertheless, the ox killed someone. And so the Torah is at least make those kinds of distinctions. Let's go on. Let's go back and take a look at Rashi on this. And you're getting a little taste of why this Parsha is such a huge source of halachic development. V'chi gachshor, and if a ox gores, and the tractate that deals with injury is Baba Kama. Literally, that means the first gate. So there are three bavot, there are three gates. There's the first gate, there's the middle gate, that's the Baba Metzia, and then there's Baba Batra, the last gate. They all deal with this kind of law, both criminal and civil cases. Echad shor ve'echad kol be'emo. And again, we notice that the Torah is talking about an ox. And we want, again, think about it, how people interpret the Bible and whether they interpret it literally or not. And if you were to interpret the Bible literally, you would say the Torah is only talking about an ox. But we have, as you see already, here's another example, that we do not interpret the Torah literally. We understand the Torah in a larger sense than that. So here we go. He says, Echad shor ve'echad kol behema v'chaya va'of. It's whether or not it's an ox, or whether it's any cattle or wild beast or bird. So why does the Torah just talk about an ox? Ela shediber hakatuv b'hoveh. But what happens is the Torah speaks about the most common case. It's simply trying to present a case. It is not, we do not understand the Torah as limiting itself only to oxen. And of course, this is a very, very ancient tradition, that this is the way we understand it. V'lo ye'achel et besaro. So it says, and its flesh should not be eaten, right? The ox is killed, but you don't eat the flesh. You don't benefit from it in some way. And this is, interestingly enough, in Tractate Pesachim, in the tractate that deals with the laws of Pesach. Mimashma shene'emar sakol yisakel. From the implication, in other words, from what we can infer from the statement in the Torah that says it shall be stoned, hashor, that the ox should be stoned, eni yodea, can't I already infer shehi nevela, that it's considered that the meat of such an animal is considered carrion, unevela asura ba'achila, and we know from the book of Leviticus that any animal that dies and either unnaturally or naturally, but is not nishchat, is not slaughtered, is not killed according to the laws of kashrut, it is forbidden to eat it. It's considered a nevela. It's considered carrion. And since this ox has been stoned to death, it hasn't been shechted, well, of course we can't eat it. So why is the Torah saying it shall not be eaten? Elama Talmud lomar velo ye'achel et besaro. So why is Scripture teaching us, why is the Torah teaching us that its flesh should not be eaten? She'afilu shachto. The point about this is, we know things happen, and of course circumstances, that even if it was nishchat, in other words, even if a shochet killed the animal, killed that ox that had gored, la'achar shenigmar dino, after it has been determined by a court that this ox was a goring ox, that this was the ox that killed another, and that the ox was the cause of that person's death, even if it was shechted asur ba'achila, it is nevertheless forbidden to eat it. And this is Baba Kama. You see, there we go, discussing Mem Aleph, page 41. So the question still is, Bahana Minayan. Well, what about if you want to sell it, right? You want to sell the leather or the skin, or get some make some profit from this particular ox. Talmud Lomar, for this reason, and it's an unusual. Rashi's going to tell us this is a drush on Baal Hashor Naki, on the phrase of the owner of the ox Naki is clean. And he's saying this, we're going to explain a little bit further. This is referring to the fact that he is not going to be able to sell the carcass of his animal, to a non-Jew, for example, or to a tannery or anything. Ka'adam, and this, in this phrase, Baal Hashor Naki, the owner of the ox is clean. Ka'adam ha'omer, it's similar, this use of the word clean is similar to someone who says l'chaveiro, who says to his neighbor, Yatsa ploni naki min chachav. This person has been cleaned out of his possessions. He has gone out clean of his possessions. And in fact, we even sometimes use that term in English, where if somebody asks us if we happen to have any loose change, we might say to them, I'm clean of loose change. So that's how one way to understand the Torah here. Ve'ein lo bahem hana'ah shel klum. And so he's gone, he's cleared off his possessions, and he has no benefit from them at all. So even selling the ox, you cannot get any profit out of this ox that has killed someone. Zehu midrasho, and here Rashi tells us this is a drash. This is a midrashic interpretation. Upshuto kamashma'o. However, it's the simple meaning of this verse is just as it implies. And in other words, that he's clean, he's not guilty. He's not held accountable now for this. He's not held responsible for this particular event that took place because he had no idea that this ox was going to gore. And so if this ox, in fact, kills someone, he cannot be held responsible. And that's what this is, Baal Hashor Naki. That's the simple understanding of this. Upshuto kamashma'o. Lefishinemar. So why? Why? Because it says bemu'ad. Regarding an mu'ad is an ox that is known to be a goring ox. And we're going to go on to that example, because it said regarding an ox that is a habitual gorer, that we know tends to gore people. Okay. V'gam ba'alav yumat. It says in that case, and the owner of the ox too shall be put to death. Do not, hold on to your harnesses. Okay. Hutzrach lomar. But just there it says that Hutzrach lomar batam. You have to state regarding an ox. A tam means one that is not a goring, not known to be a goring ox. Uval hashor naki. That's why the Torah emphasizes that in this case, this owner is not held liable. Now, I will tell you already, we're going to get onto this, right? In other words, do we understand the Torah literally again, that the owner has to be put to death for not being responsible and taking extra precautions regarding an ox that he knows is a clear and present danger? So that's the general issue that we're getting into. So we move to the more complicated case. Ve'im shor nagachu, and if it is a goring ox, mitmol shimshon, from yesterday and the day before. And we're going to discuss why the Torah puts it that way. Okay. Let's move here. V'hu'ad biva'alav, and its owner was warned. V'lo yishmerenu, but he doesn't take extra precautions to guard it. He does not guard this ox. He's been told, he's been warned about it, but he has not. In other words, he's fully conscious we've established that he is fully conscious of how dangerous his ox is. And of course, we know while the Torah is just talking about an ox, we're talking about any situation, anything that you may own that represents a clear and pleasant danger, but we'll get onto other categories. Here we're talking about animals. V'heimit ish or isha, and this ox kills a man or a woman. Ashur, and here we're going to see what Rashi was referring to. Yisakel will be stoned. V'gam ba'alav yumat, and his owner too will be held to a capital punishment, will also be killed. We are going to have to obviously deal with this. With the little time we have, are there any questions at this point before I get into the Rashi on this? All this Torah Tamina that we are passing through. Okay. Mitmol shulshon, from yesterday and the day before. Hare shalosh negichot. In other words, in order for this ox to be considered a mu'ad, to be a goring ox for sure, it has to have done it 3 times. In other words, we know oxen do gore, but that doesn't mean that it's a clear and present danger on the level of an ox that you know is a dangerous animal, a clear and present danger. So they're trying again to apply from the Torah itself the application of this law. And how do you define what you consider to be a goring ox? Fahu'ad biva'alav, and his owner has been warned. And this is in Baba Kama, page 23, Lashon Hatra'ah. This has the meaning of forewarning, ba'edim, with witnesses. In other words, this person has been formally warned, right, by a court, or by representatives of a court, or by people who will then testify in court that he has been warned. So again, a very thoughtful, deliberate process here. And he gives an example, Bereshit Mem Gimel. This is Genesis chapter 43. This is, I'm going to say, Ha'ed Ha'id Banu Ha'ish, where the brothers, Joseph's brothers, who don't recognize Joseph, they've come back to the land of Canaan from Egypt, and they tell Jacob that Joseph, that this man had really warned them, right, about coming back. Remember, Joseph said, don't come back unless you bring Benjamin. So, or giving them warning. Behemit ish, etc., and it killed a man, etc. Lefi she'ne'emar ki yigach, the fact that it says it has that the ox gored someone, ein li ella shehemito benegicha, I might think, right? It says gored. I might think that the case is limited to one where the ox actually gored the person, right? Hemito beneshicha, if this ox killed someone by biting them, dechifa, or pushing them, or ve'ita, or kicking them, minayin. How do we know that this law applies in these cases as well? Because the Torah only specifically speaks about goring. Again, back to this issue of us not taking the Torah on a purely literal level. Talmud Loma, and for this reason, Scripture teaches vehemit. It goes on to say, and killed. In other words, the issue is the killing, not the goring. V'gam ba'alav yumat. Here we go. And its owner will be killed, will die as well. Bidei shamayim. This is at the hands of heaven, meaning a court is not going to pass a sentence on him of death. It is considered this is a divine punishment. Yachol bidei adam. Okay, so Rashi says, well, let's look at this. Is it possible that this person should be killed at the hands of humans, in other words, by a court? Talmud Lomar, and for this reason, Scripture teaches in the book of Numbers, chapter 35, Mot Yumat Hamakeh, where it says, the one who strikes shall surely be put to death. Rotzeach hu, he is a murderer. So, murder is a capital offense. And in fact, in that case, a court can sentence that person with death. Al ritzichato ata horgo. And because it adds these words, he is a murderer, which are not necessary, we understand that the Torah is trying to teach us something additional. And what is it? Al ritzichato ata horgo. You can sentence him to death only for his murder, if he actually is committing murder. Ve'i ata horgo al ritzichat shoro, and you cannot put him to death for the murder of his ox. So again, we understand that we are going to limit the application of capital punishment as much as possible. And of course, elsewhere we have talked already about some of the safety protections to understand that once you sentence a person to death, you can't bring it back. So they have to be unbelievable protections. And in fact, the Torah is going to go on, and we are going to have to stop here. We are not finished entirely, but we're going to see how the Torah itself is going to talk about compensation. Of course, this is some of the greatest stuff in terms of halakha. Okay, I'll stop the share. Okay, any thoughts, any comments? Lawrence?
Yeah.
Okay, Harlan, go for it.
Okay. When that man that owns that ox knows about the ox and knows that the ox is a bad ox and will injure people, does the both of them get capital punishment, or does the court not give capital punishment? Only God gives the capital punishment to
That's
that.
what we just learned. Harlan, that's just what
That's what's confusing to me.
Yes, no. Rashi's trying to clarify that the court will only sentence a person to capital punishment if they themselves have themselves committed the murder. Okay.
Oh,
Not for the ox. You cannot sentence him to a capital punishment. And in fact, we haven't finished the entire section, this entire law. So, okay. So yeah, just to be very clear about it. Lauren, did you want to say something?
Well, when it talks about the punishment will be heavenly,
Yes.
I mean, is it supposed to be like Nadav and Avihu that they're struck dead immediately? Does it mean they just don't have an afterlife, but they can live their life however they want to? I mean,
I think the point is, if I'm not interrupting you, I think the point is this, that this is not for the court to determine. That we believe that every single one of us will be held accountable for our behavior. And essentially, and in some cases, of course, it is for a court to determine the consequences of our behavior. And there's a distinction between those two things. And what I believe we're saying here is that in this particular case, whether this person deserved a death sentence or not is up to God, but not that something immediate is going to happen. There is a whole discussion elsewhere about various categories that involve divine punishment, because there's more than just one type or one phrase that is used to describe it. So, but I think the point here is that this is a case which we have to leave to God, who of course knows the truth. So, okay.
I got another problem.
Sure.
When a master knocks out a tooth or an eye of a slave, does he go free? Does a slave go free because he's damaged?
Okay, so
if you damage somebody's eye and he works and needs that eye to work with, that he should go free. I know slaves go free on seventh day or something like that in the Jubilee. They go free, but when you knock out somebody's eye and tooth, they should go free. Even though he's Jewish,
Harlan,
if he's Jewish, why doesn't he go free?
Because he's compensated. Because he's compensated. Because the Jew is compensated. Okay. Oh. That's why. That's what Rashi was telling us, is that if he's Jewish, he is not freed because of his, the injury. He'll be paid. He'll be compensated. And yesterday we discussed these various ways that there is the loss of use of, there's the actual loss of his eye because he can't see now, and he's valued in a different way. There is the pain he experienced. There is the humiliation that he experienced. He has to be paid for that. He has to, if there are any medical expenses, he has to be paid for that. Okay. if in the case of someone who, let's say, is just is not a slave, if he's lost work, he has to be compensated for his work time. So there are all these various ways in which a person needs to be compensated if a person injures someone else. It does not apply. These do not apply to a Canaanite slave. Okay. So, okay, I'm going to stop right here.